First of all, let me thank Nikos Papadimitriou and Maria Toli for inviting me to comment on Dr. Pηλείδου's paper. And let me thank Dr. Pηλείδου for providing me with an English copy of her paper in advance. First of all, I just want to say that her description of this key central region of the island and the previous work carried out there provides an important contribution in and of itself. And nothing like it exists in the literature, certainly not in the books that I've written on the subject. So that's a very good start. Regarding her overview of the Late Bronze Age, I have a couple of brief comments. For one, the urban coastal centers of Late Bronze Age Cyprus certainly would have served as transshipment points where local resources and trade fed into broader regional systems, but they also played major and quite different roles in the internal political and economic structure of the island. Another point is that although I would agree that Cyprus's external trade with the Aegean, Egypt, and the Levant made a significant impact on the island's material culture generally, it was not the only and probably not the most important reason for the emergence of these urban centers with monumental architecture and all the other changes that characterize the centuries between 1600 and 1200 BC. For these, we must look to internal as well as external developments. Regarding the landscape around Άγιο Σωζόμενο, in particular that associated with the Yaljas River, Michael Brown's suggestion that this watercourse might have served for the downriver transport of copper or timber, whilst interesting, is entirely speculative. We don't know that that river ran deep enough, long enough, or at all in the Bronze Age. To speculate further on this basis that the Yaljas watershed and by extension Southeast Cyprus might be identified with Alashia, the place name by which Cyprus overall was known in contemporary cuneiform documents, simply does not hold any water at all. When in the past I've seen references to Άγιο Σωζόμενο, I immediately associated them either with the locality Ambelia, which Dr. Pηλείδου mentioned, regarded as the most important and largest site in this region's cluster, although we can't quite find it again. And I think one of the more important things that this project will do with its survey, topography, and GIS work is to relocate this site. I also, of course, would have thought of Nikolidis and Glikiavrisi, the two of the more than 20 sites known as forts belonging to this Middle Cypriot III, Late Cypriot I period around 1600 BC. The identification of these sites as forts is perhaps the least controversial interpretation. Whilst Peltenberg has outlined one possible scenario to explain their role, I'm not convinced about the militaristic or defensive functions that have been proposed. Whom exactly were these fortifications defending, and against what threat? The only one of the sites up on the plateau that has been surveyed well enough to show the plan of the structures, Dali Kafkalia, looks more like an agricultural settlement than a fort. Yet one has to wonder why people would have established such a settlement on the plateau when the plain below was so much more fertile and well-watered, as is the case with Geopoulos. The fact is we just know far too little about the nature of sites and the settlement makeup of the Middle Cypriot III, Late Cypriot I period. Phases from this period at other well-known sites are typically buried under the extensive debris of later town centers, those of the late Cypriot II and III periods. Other sites of the period itself are known only through survey, from excavations conducted in the 1920s or 1930s, or from incompletely published excavations, like Kufos, Van Romani, and so on, or still in progress, like Scalia. The only sites whose function we really understand are industrial in nature, like Sanida, a pottery production site, and Politico Forades, a copper production site. Yet this is also a period when the hints we have from the archaeological record point to something momentous happening. For example, the mega sites in the Calabasas River Valley in the south central part of the island, the emergence of all these new coastal centers and the increasing contacts with the Levant, the intensification of copper production, and of course, these enigmatic forts around Άγιο Σωζόμενο. What we have now at Georgopoulos offers the potential to broaden this very restricted view of a crucial time period on Cyprus. It is a site that belongs, on present evidence at least, to the late Cypriot I period, one that is being excavated and set within its regional context with all the archaeological and scientific expertise that a modern project can muster. The materials thus far recovered, which you've seen from within and around a multi-room building, copper flat axe and pin, a range of different types of pithoi, numerous stone tools, grinders, axes, clay basins, loom weights, some animal bones, do not signal at this stage, at least in my view, much more than the remains we would normally associate with an agricultural village of the Middle and Late Cypriot periods. And by this, I don't mean an agricultural support village, like I tried to define in my site hierarchies, but a level 2 agricultural village. One that has different workshops, it would seem, possibly. Certainly good storage facilities and stone wells. Anyway, it's early days, so we have to see, and we have to see how big this site is. Equally significant, I think, is the presence of a fragmentary Canaanite jar, which, by the way, do occasionally have Cyprominoan signs inscribed on them, and which, in my view, doesn't necessarily mean local production, but rather, as Dr. Pηλείδου says, production for Cypriot consumption. Despite the possible attribution of local production of some of these Canaanite jars from Ma Paleocastro on the basis of chemical analysis, the majority of all known Canaanite jars analyzed chemically or petrographically were manufactured along the Levantine coast, from the area around the Bay of Haifa to central Lebanon. And I'll talk a little more about this on Thursday night at the Italian Archaeological Institute. Thus, I would say that the fragmentary Canaanite jar most likely is an import, as is the incised stirrup jar fragment. Whatever Άγιο Σωζόμενος Georgopoulos turns out to be, it will provide a new, unprecedented look at a crucially important site of this Middle Cypriot III, Late Cypriot I period, in a region of the island still very poorly understood archaeologically, yet in an area where survey has shown the prominence of several sites of this period. Situated midway between the copper-bearing pillow lavas in the Troodos foothills and the Mesoria, it is located strategically along a riverine course and communication route that led to an area that has spawned, over the millennia, 3 of the wealthiest and most important harbors on Cyprus, Enkomi, Salamis, and Famagusta. These new excavations and the associated geophysical survey should shed some much-needed light on Central Cyprus during a time that would prove to be the most dynamic in the island's prehistory.
Thank you very much, Professor Knapp, and now we're going to have questions. I have one, if you don't mind. Okay, to start with. I ask in English. For the Aegean, if we had such size pithoi or Minoan stirrup jar of quite early date, I suppose, because Minoan stirrup jars are not that common in Cyprus anyway, I suppose. We wouldn't call this an agricultural settlement only. I mean, we would expect that these, if I understand, the pithoi are quite large, aren't they? So this means storage on a quite large scale, or possibly storage on a quite large scale. So would you like to comment on this? I mean, for both of you, I'm taking
Well, yes, storage jars are quite a few, and some of them belong to size 3, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, this will be much more clear when we actually restore the pithoi. But the general impression that one gets from the excavation, apart from those two specimens, the stirrup jar and the Canaanite jar, everything else is local and agricultural. I mean, this is the idea that we get from this part of the building for now. It will be very important to see how extensive the site is, because that, I think, will be a very important factor in its interpretation. And the impression that we get is that it is quite extensive. So size will, I think, play an important role. And what is happening in the rest of the settlement.
Yeah, okay. When you say late Cypriot II, can you specify this more?
No, I don't want to
yet?
specify now, although I have a feeling that it is not, it doesn't extend into 2C. Yeah. That is a very preliminary assessment of the material, but I mean, we need to look at the material much more thoroughly before we are ready.
Pre-13th century.
Yes, as far as I know.
So, questions?
I am a bit puzzled by elite. The argument usually goes that the exploitation of the natural resources of the island, and especially the copper deposits, created the wealth that led to the formation of an elite class. But who organized the exploitation? The elites must have been there before the exploitation started. Who else would have organized such exploitation? So to really understand the formation of an elite class in Cyprus, we have to go back well into the Middle Cypriot period, it seems to me.
But I don't think that, as I said, in the surveys that were carried out in the area of Άγιο Σωζόμενο, not many Middle Cypriot settlements have been identified. The settlements that are quite dense, that have been identified, begin from the end of the Middle Cypriot in that area. I agree with you that somebody must have organized, I mean, a certain group of people must have been responsible for organizing the kind of production that was going on. It's even now you can see that it is a large, arable, fertile area with a lot of resources. And it must have played quite an important role in production in general. And if indeed it was utilized together with the copper resources, then it was important in that way economically, and therefore it must have been under some kind of control. And this is perhaps one of the things that the continuation of the excavation might help us to understand, how all this was organized and from where, and when did this start, and when it ended, and why did it end? Why did they have to move after a while? Why doesn't it extend after LC2, the end of LC2? So it is one of the questions that I hope that the geomorphological study, the GIS survey, will also help us to understand, because for the first time all these factors and all these parameters that are in play within the area of Άγιο Σωζόμενο will be understood through the use of technology and these new methods. Thank you.
You can't go very far back into the Middle Cypriot period because what you find are settlements like Marquis, which is one of the best excavated settlements on the whole island in any period. And this is an agricultural village par excellence. The excavators there have never speculated more than to say that this was probably an egalitarian level village, and certainly nothing at the site suggests there's no house that stands out. There's not even a storage area or whatever. These are all houses or structures of the same size. By the Middle Cypriot III period, let us say by the late 1800, 1700 BC, all of this begins to change dramatically across the island. And we see sites, admittedly, some of them unexcavated, like those in the Calabasas Valley. But we also begin to see a site like Enkami, which can only, this is a huge urban site. This is nothing like Marquis Alonia. And so I guess if you want to find, you said the word elites like you were begging for a definition. Well, we only know elites through what they left us in this case. And what they left us from this time period onward is pretty impressive. You can use another term if you like. I know you like to run to your dictionary and call into question a lot of terms that are used, but the rest of us will call them elites.
It's interesting that at the time Cyprus seems to take off, the same thing happens on Crete, as we now see in Malia, Cartier-Mou. What is the connection? Why do these two islands suddenly start to explode in development at around the same time?
I should have thought the Minoan burst was a little bit earlier, and unlike many of my colleagues, I see very little relationship between what's going on Crete and what's going on in Cyprus. If I were to put Cyprus in context, I look to the Levant, not to the Aegean, especially at this period of time, when the contacts with the Aegean are extremely limited, but those with the Levant explode. So, I mean, I don't deny there might be a connection, but I'm not sure what it is. And I think that others have recently, for example, tried to make the link between what happened on Cyprus, they've tried to link that with what we see at the site of Tel Deba in the Egyptian Delta, which Broodbank in his recent book called I've forgotten the term, but let's say a giant emporium of the late Middle Bronze Age. I would look in that direction if I wanted to try and find some explanation for what was happening on Cyprus in terms of an external factor. But I think that this needs to be rethought very carefully. And probably the first thing that has to happen is the excavator at Tel Deba has to realize that his chronology is completely out of whack with the rest of the Eastern Mediterranean. But beyond that, I don't know about these connections between Cyprus and Crete.
And yet it would now seem that in the metal workshops at Cartier-Mou in Malia, they were using Cypriot copper. So there are definite connections between the two.
So the demand for copper may have been the reason. The demand for copper and the intensification of copper production in Cyprus may have been one of the factors that actually led to this urbanization.
I don't want to belabor these things, but we started out talking about the question of the size of settlements, and also about internal developments, and we're in an agricultural zone, an area of agricultural plenty. If you're going to increase copper production, presumably you're also increasing craft activities in a number of areas, and so you're going to have to increase surplus production of your agricultural activities. You can't do that very easily without having groups of people who start to organize labor. We really have to talk about mobilization of labor across the landscape. There are issues of irrigation and issues of managing intensification of crop production, and normally we look to these kinds of things when we're talking about internal developments that can lead to differentiation socially and people ordering other people around. And you know, that can lead willy-nilly to something you might want to call elites. I mean, the term is a weak term because it embraces a multitude of forms. But I mean, what's interesting here is, especially with respect to storage and storage jars, is the rise of this. You don't, I mean, and you already showed us, you know, the other Cypriot sites that show elements of mass storage. I wouldn't look to Crete, but if I were talking about Crete, I'd think more of places like Kanya, near Gorton, that in any of these country sites that are sometimes called villas that actually are secondary orders, as you point out, and they engage in a lot of surplus production of agricultural produce that supports places like Enkumi. I mean, that seems to me pretty simply what's going on, unless I miss the point.
Can I ask, just to clarify this kind of thing, what we saw with the large, I know it's too early, but the impression is that these big storage jars date to as early as late Cypriot I?
Certainly into late Cypriot I and later, yes.
And do we have other examples of such kind of storage from this period in Cyprus?
Well, yes. I mean, most of the sites, the large sites, where storage was in evidence, not so much the coastal cities, but like Kalavassos, Agios Dimitrios, Maroni. Yes, we have them from LC1. Yes, yes, yes.
Άλλες ερωτήσεις επίσης θυμίζω ότι το σεμινάριο είναι και ελληνικό, δεν είναι μόνο αγγλικό. Παρακαλούμε.
Thank you. although I'm not a specialist of this period at all, I'm interested in the storage jars again. And I wanted to, maybe you said and I didn't understand. Do they all belong to the same type? No. So there are different types, different sizes, but of the same.
Yes.
And this is important for the assessment
Yes.
of the organ, because big or elite maybe buildings should be equipped, you know, with uniform or with size. Pithoi of the same size or similar size, but if this is not the case, and this is a gradual, you know, development,
Yes.
maybe.
Yes, you're right.
Yes.
I did say that there is a great variety of storage jars, from the smaller sizes to the biggest. But it's not just the biggest. I mean, it's nothing like Kalavasos Agios Dimitrios, the Pithos Hall, where you have, you know, storage of size 2 and size 3 pithoi. It's different sizes, but there are quite a few which seem to be large ones. Yes, I am not sure if they are size 3 or the largest of size 2, because that you have to really restore and measure, you know, take all the measurements and see what the volume was. But in any case, they were big enough, but not all the same and not all in one room.
Any other questions? Άλλες ερωτήσεις, συγγνώμη, τώρα έχω... Αν δεν υπάρχουν άλλες ερωτήσεις, καταρχήν θα πούμε ότι θα συνεχίσουμε, όποιος θέλει τέλος πάντων, θα παρακαλέσουμε την ομιλήτρια και τον κύριο Πηλείδου και τον κύριο Knapp να έρθουν στον τρίτο όροφο που είναι η Κυπριακή μας συλλογή. Εκ μέρους και της διοργανώτριας κυρίας Μαρίας Τόλη, να ευχαριστήσουμε την κυρία Πηλείδου και τον κύριο Knapp για τη σημερινή παρουσίαση.